So hello friends, how are you? Welcome to Mentor Vikas channel, and in this video we understand how in Qwik application you can use resources and why it is being used, right? So resources is used when you want to create a new value out of some pre-existed value, but this pre-existed value is not from our Qwik component, because if that value is directly coming from our component, I think we should go with that use computed, which I had already discussed. But if that value that we are receiving is coming from some API request, right? So then I think it should use resource, right? So so it not just should, but you should use resource. Okay, so use the resource is used when you have to create a new computed value out of the value which is coming from the API request endpoint or some endpoint, right? Or if you are just don't want to use this use computed, or in simple words, if you don't want to use this synchronous function, right? Because use computed is a synchronous function, you just want to use that asynchronous function. You want to change the whole function into that asynchronous function, right? So you can, in such cases also, you can go with use resource, right? So it is quite clear, use resources is an asynchronous function, okay? And mostly the use resources is being used when you want to create a new value out of the values which is being received from some external API endpoint or some external data source, right? So how you can use this? You can use this in our application is just simplest manner, right? And the one point you have to understand here, or you have to note here, that it also uses, whenever you uses that user resources component, you can also use that resource component, okay? You can also use this resource resource component, which is also being defined by that Qwik application to access the value of this Qwik resource, of this use resource hook. Okay, sometimes I muffle, okay, so please ignore. Okay, so sometimes if you are just willing to access the value, directly access this value of use resource, so Qwik application already had provided you a built-in component which you can use to access the value which is computed by use resources. Okay, so let's understand now how you can use in our Qwik application and how you can implement this use resource in our Qwik application. So to do that, as you can see here, we had just imported 4 things. Out of these 4, 2 are our hooks, okay, and 1 is our component, and 1 is a state management tool, okay, a state management kind of function, okay, and that is provided by our Qwik application. So use this signal is used to manage the state in our application. As you can see here, it is managed a PR number, and that PR number is a string, right? Simple. So, and the second thing, as you can see here, we are using use resource, and whatever the value is computed out of this use resource is now being stored in our PR title, right? So whatever the value is being returned by this use resource block is now being stored in PR title. So whatever here we are returning, you can simply access this value by simply calling this PR title, right? Great. As you can see, this user resource is, as I had told you, right? So this user resource is an asynchronous function. Okay, so here we had mentioned, okay, it's an asynchronous function, right? And here we had just passes some value, so it could be any argument, right? So here we had just passes and track argument, right? So what is this track? I don't think that you have to focus on this, because I will tell you what is this track is, right? So for now, just leave this track. Okay, so now you just have to go with this part. as you can see here, we are just making an API request. Okay, and because it is an asynchronous function, we have to use that await function, await keyword, right? So here we are using this await, and then we uses this fetch request, and whatever the value is being computed out of this fetch request, or after the successful fetching of the data from this URL endpoint, from this endpoint, we will have a response. So that response is being stored in this. Okay, and finally we have to get the data. So we had just converted this response into the JSON format, and finally after converting this response into JSON format, we just want to access the data.title. Okay, so the simple thing is, there we have some values coming from this endpoint, and whatever the value is coming from that endpoint, it should also contain a title. Okay, so that is an the output would be an object, and that object contains a term, a key, that is title, and we just want to access the value of that title, right? So we just here return our data.title, and because the whole Qwik application is worked in TypeScript, so here we had just mentioned its output type, right? So the output type is string. As you can also see here, we had also declared at the very earlier stage that okay, whatever the output of this useResource is is a string, right? So here we had defined our type. So now let's talk about this track. So what this track basically is, and why we are using this track. So this track is something that tells this useResource, okay, when to recompute this value, when to recompute this whole value, right? So this track is already being presented or given by our Qwik application, right? So this method is used to understand or to justify, okay, that when should this useResource will trigger. Okay, so as we had mentioned here in a track, so track is an asynchronous function, and this basically simply specify, okay, after whenever this value, that is that PR number, has changed, our application has to make an API request to that endpoint once again, right? And as you can see, we have to, whenever we want to use that access the value of this PR number, we have to mention, we just simply don't call this value as PR number, okay, because that is the wrong way to call the value in Qwik application, right? So we have to call this like so, PR dot value, right? So here we had just specified that whenever the value of this PR number changes, this useResources will trigger again, and whatever the value is being returned from this useResource function is now being stored into this PR title. Okay, so as it is clearly visible that here we are not getting data from our state, already pre-existed state, but we are depending upon some data which is coming from some external API, right? So in such cases we have to use useResource. And in another case, if that new computed value is based on the variables which is already being managed in our application, then in such cases we should go with use computed state, which I had already been discussed, right? So finally, as you can see here, finally to render these values into our component, we had just created an h1 tag, right? And here in this h1 tag, we just printed the value of this PR number. Okay, we had just printed this value of the PR number. And what is this PR number? This is the PR number, right? And after then we uses this resource. Okay, so let's understand this resource which we had earlier imported from our builder.io/Qwik, right? So what this useResources does. Okay, so before going to explain this useResource, I am just want to tell you that it is just not required. Even though without using this resource, you can simply have this value. you can access this value, right? So it is not required that you should always use useResource, but because of Qwik application has give you this functionality, you can use this resource component, right? So without if you are not willing to use this resource component, you can simply access this value whatever is written from there here by simply accessing this PR title, right? As you can understand here. Okay, so but in another way, use resource give you some additional configuration or some additional functionality. So use resource have 3 states, right? So firstly, whenever you uses this resource component in your Qwik application, you have to specify, okay, so for which resource, for which use resource you are willing to use this resource component. Okay, so we have to specify, like for example, maybe here we had created multiple use resources, right? So we have to specify that, okay, for PR title, the resource, the user resource hook which is related to this PR title tag, PR title variable, I am just willing to access that user resource, right? So here we had just mentioned it's a PR title, right? So the value which is coming from, so the value which is so the use resource associated with this associated with the PR title should have the value here. Okay, so the next we have next 2 states as it is there. What should we have to display in our component till we don't have getting the data? So it is in pending state. So in that scenario, we have to we had just specify here, okay, till then if that promise had not resolved, so in that case I just want to show that loading tag. Okay, so here we had just created an p element, that paragraph having a text of loading, right? But when the when this function is successfully resolved, then in such case we have to go with this on resolved. Okay, and on resolved, what we had written, we have an title which is a string. So we just want to display that string in an h2 tag. Okay, and there user resource, there this resource also provide you one more function which is on rejection. Okay, so on rejection, I think it was on rejection or on error. I don't think on yeah, it is on reject. Okay, so on reject there should be an error. Okay, so how you are willing to handle that error, you can also mention here if you are willing to, right? So this is how you can use that use resource to compute a new value out of the values which is coming from some external API, right? So this is how you can use that, and you can also use that use resource when you want to change, when you don't want to use that use computed, instead of you want to make that computational part an asynchronous function. In such cases you can also use resource. Okay, so I think now you have a clear understanding of how you can use this user resource in your Qwik application and what is the purpose of this user resource. Okay, so for this video I think this is enough, and soon I will meet you in our next video. Till then, have a nice day and goodbye.